Hi there, welcome to the latest episode of my 10-minute moan. And this topic of this 10-minute moan is looking at the comparisons between Nazi Germany's propaganda Radio Caledonia and the current day SNP. Now, this is crazy, right? This is really funny. And it's a story that popped up in the Express. Now, I know what's going to happen here. All the SNP cult, oh, it's the Express, right? And they'll just, you can't listen to it, you can't. Well, that's fine, right? If you don't want to listen to the Express, don't. So today, turn off the new. But I bet you don't, right? Because you love watching my videos and then tell me everything I say is wrong, right? So I guarantee you that's what the retort will be from the cult. It's the Express, so it's a lot of bollocks. Well, it's not a lot of bollocks. They actually point out about this thing called Radio Caledonia that was Goebbels, Hitler's PR guy, the spin doctor, who created this, I'd never heard of it before, radio station during the war to try and encourage Scottish people to turn against the English people and against the Union, right? So I'm going to, I'll go through the story, then I'll give you my own views once I'm finished, if I can keep my mouth shut during the story. So their headline is How Nazi Propaganda Chief Goebbels Helped Shape the SNP's Arguments that are still used today. Cracker, right? An extraordinary new study examines the legacy of Hitler's chief secretary, David Grant, who broadcast a black propaganda station called Radio Caledonia, calling for a separate Scotland and attempting to undermine morale. A major new academic study has shed new light on Nazi Germany's extraordinary wartime propaganda effort to boost Scottish nationalism and help break up the UK. Sounds like the modern day Iran. The study uses new evidence from national archives at Kew, the Bundesarchiv in Germany, and BBC archives to examine the legacy of Radio Caledonia and the traitor Donald Grant, dubbed Scotland's Lord Haw-Haw. So it concludes that Grant was an opportunist acting under the direct orders of Hitler's propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels. Incredibly, many of the arguments he concocted are still used by the SNP, politicians and other Scottish nationalists today. The research paper called Radio Caledonia, Scottish Nationalism and Nazi Radio Propaganda was published by the Journal of Historical Studies earlier this year. Author Graham Smythe describes how the station began broadcasting Scottish nationalist, anti-government and anti-war propaganda in June 1940, supposedly from somewhere in Scotland. He adds its objective was to bring about Scotland's exit from the war, an end to the capitalist system and the creation of an independent socialist Scotland. This all sounds familiar. In reality, Radio Caledonia was one of several radio stations broadcast from Bureau Concordia, the radio arm of the Nazi propaganda ministry in Berlin. Smythe writes, its purpose was to convince the Scottish public that Britain had no business taking part in the war, that defeat would be swift and devastating, and that Scotland should make its own peace with Germany under a new Scottish government. Keep a light on for us kind of thing, eh? Grant was born in Alness in Ross and Cromarty in 1907 and moved to London in the 30s, where he joined Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists and then the even more viciously anti-Semitic Imperial Fascist League. He left the UK for Nazi Germany in July 1939, telling a friend he wanted to see the miracles which fascism has accomplished there. After being briefly imprisoned at the start of the war, his IFL contacts secured his release and worked for a few months in the factories of Hanover before the Gestapo summoned him to Berlin for a job interview with Concordia chief Erich Hetzler. The interview took place on June 17, 1940, the day of the French surrender. Concordia had been broadcasting black propaganda on two stations, one aimed at hard left in France and the other called Vox de la Bretonne, which was supposedly the work of Breton separatists. Goebbels was convinced the broadcasts had played a part in weakening French morale, and now he wanted to turn his attentions to Britain. He created 4 black radio stations aimed at socialists, pacifists, Scottish and Welsh nationalists, although the latter never actually got off the ground. They would broadcast alongside the white propaganda of William Joyce, the infamous Lord Haw-Haw, who, with listeners aware that he was broadcasting from behind enemy lines, with his trademark opening, Germany calling, Germany calling. Smythe described Joyce as an articulate and talented writer who edited and even wrote many of Grant's scripts for Radio Caledonia. By contrast, the Scots' own work was often dull and formulaic. Grant, who was given false papers in the name of Donald Palmer and paid 500 Reichsmarks per month, compared to the 30 Reichsmarks per month he received in the factory. Must have been quite a salary at the time. He worked alongside colleagues to scour BBC broadcasts and British newspapers for stories that would inform his nightly broadcasts. He told listeners that the war was being fought for English vested interests and that a group of irresponsible politicians in London dragged us Scottish people into this war, which does not concern us and which we never wanted. Smythe writes, much was made of living and working conditions in Scotland. The overcrowded Glasgow slums and hovels, low wages, the difficulties of farmers, fishermen, crofters, dockers, ship workers and miners, all problems which were laid at the door of Churchill. Sound familiar as well? The Jews and the capitalists. Churchill, not Hitler, was the enemy of Scotland. He was to be brought before a court of Scottish workers. Grant claimed that Scotland's anti-aircraft guns had been robbed to protect London. Wow. And that permission to sound air raid sirens had to be granted from somewhere in England. In September 1940, Grant announced the existence of the Scottish Peace Front, an imaginary organisation whose members were encouraged to demonstrate against the war. After a period off the airways from November 1940 to April 41, Caledonia resumed with less vitriol and more humour, sarcasm and satire. Smythe speculates that Goebbels was not impressed with Grant's earlier efforts. Excuse me. Now a major feature of the broadcast was attacking British newspapers and the BBC. Familiar? With the slogan, "Oh, how they lie," and an early version of a fact-checking service to highlight alleged lies, contradictions and inconsistencies. Radio Caledonia was finally axed in July 1942, and the author says it was regarded as a failure with irregular broadcasts, patchy reception and poor content. But British morale failed to collapse under the Nazi propaganda efforts, as had been the case in France. If anything, the opposite was the case. Despite this, Grant continued to work at Bureau Concordia for the rest of the war and spent more than a year on the run before handing himself into the British in October 1946. He was described as a pathetic figure and charged with 7 counts of assisting the enemy. Now, this is interesting. Joyce and his fellow protagonists, Andrew Emery, were convicted of treason and hanged, but Grant received just 6 months in prison when he was sentenced to the Old Bailey in 1947. Smythe writes, the judge believed that the absence of evidence as to what Grant had actually broadcast, a jury might well have found that he'd worked on behalf of Scotland and not for Germany. He described Grant as a British fascist who had shown no interest in separatism until he joined Concordia, pointing out that during almost 2 years of radio broadcasts he never produced... Sorry, I lost a wee bit. He never produced any serious proposals for how a separate socialist Scotland might actually look. Well, that sounds like these crackpots today as well. Given the direct and often detailed control that Goebbels exercised on the secret stations, it is certain that the policy of Scottish separatism was dictated by him and not Grant. So Goebbels was a Scottish nationalist, right? Radio Caledonia was a Nazi project when Nazi goals had the Nazis occupied Britain and installed a sympathetic fascist government. They would have shown as little interest in an independent Scotland as they had in an independent Brittany after the fall of France. The author does not draw any comparisons with the modern independence movement, adding that it would be difficult to gauge the potential for German radio propaganda to swing Scottish public opinion. Well, it kind of does it with the foreign-based social media stuff today. However, it is striking how many of the themes conceived by Goebbels are still prevalent today, such as the belief among some nationalists that BBC and newspapers tell lies, and conspiracy theories about Scottish resources being robbed for the benefit of the English. Grant claims that Scotland had been dragged into the war has often been repeated by senior SNP politicians. In 2015, Angus Robertson, then the party's Westminster leader, said Scotland was being dragged into a war with no exit strategy after Westminster voted for airstrikes against IS. The SNP have also used the same imaginary to protest about Scotland being dragged out of the EU. In addition, living and working conditions in Scotland are frequently laid at the door of the UK government, rather than the Scottish government, which has been under SNP control since 2007. After his release from prison, Grant returned to Alness, but had to leave after coming under attack. He later lived in South Africa and London, where he died in obscurity in the 1980s. So there we go. It turns out Goebbels has got the exact same ideas for Scotland as Sturgeon, Yousaf and Swinney. How's that? There you are. Enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you've not already done so, please hit the subscribe and the notification button. Let me know your comments below. But most importantly of all, unless you're one of these SNP cult that talk the same shite as Goebbels, not you, but
everyone else, have a great day. Cheerio, bye now.